To welcome everyone into Henry Hall. This is February 8th, 2026, and this is the first of what I hope are a monthly series of, say it all together, Semiquincentenial Lectures. And there you go, good.
We're spell checked.
And so that means just a fancy word for 250th. And as people are getting settled and people are logging on, I'll just say a few words about this space and Sunday Night Forums in general. So everybody online can hear this and everybody in this room can hear this. We've been doing our Sunday Night Forums from the sanctuary, and that has its pros and cons. And today we're going to do it from Henry Hall, and we're going to encounter some different pros and cons of that. And once we get kind of a good comparison, we can weigh the various the different places. And we can also do it from the conference room. Obviously, live stream matters, comfort matters, and the issue in the sanctuary is, generally speaking, there's a lot going on there prior to church, which there should be, and there's probably a lot. We have a little sheet that are in the back, and everyone should be able to see this. And we've already encountered something I didn't realize. The sun is glaring. And so it makes all the seating that I carefully put forth last night to be not in the right spot, but we'll see that. But I hope that people on our live stream can see and hear us, because I know it's bitterly cold, and some people have trouble getting here. And so thank you all for joining us, whether you're here in person or joining us online. And so the Semiquincentenial Lectures is a very grandiose, somewhat fatuous title. I do not have all the answers. I do not know everything there is to say about our nation's intersection with history and religion, but I'm going to give it a shot. And this is not going to be comprehensive in the sense that we're going to cover every aspect of all things, nor is it going to be systematic in the sense that I have a bone to pick or like a general thrust of an idea. I'm not here to say America bad. I'm not here to say America good. I'm here to say things are complicated. Life is complicated. You all know that. And we're going to lift up the struggles, and we're going to lift up the joys of that interaction. And hopefully we'll have some fun while we do it. Let's start in prayer, though, as we gather here. The Lord be with you. God, we give thanks for this day, for the gift of this country, for the gift of this community of St. Timothy's, and for the gift of technology. Help us, guide us, and lead us to a knowledge of your ways, so that we may share that with a world that needs it. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so we are starting today, and we're starting with at the beginning. And I'm not an expert on Native Americans, indigenous peoples, that sort of thing. This would be much better off if we were doing granular detail on the Battle of Gettysburg or some obscure part of church history. But when I was considering the topic, I just kept coming back to this idea of the Native Americans and that part of our history. So it's an interesting one. And there's just a couple books that I kind of read in anticipation of that. Like I said, the whole series is not, this was supposed to start in January, but the snow got in the way of it. And so we're supposed to be 12, now we're down to 11. And there's a lot of history to cover. When I used to teach American history, you start here, and then by the time you got to about April and you were still in the 19th century, then you really had to start moving. So, but there we are. I mentioned this back in December, the reason why I wanted to do this, and I mentioned this in a Word article that I'm sure that you all read. When I was a child, I read Shelby Foote's A Civil War Narrative, and it's a 3-volume history. Shelby Foote was a novelist who was drafted by Random House to write a short history of the Civil War, like 100 pages, and he expanded it out over 15 years or so, and it was this massive thing. And it has this as its epigraph at the start, and it's this quote from Ecclesiasticus, which is in the Apocrypha, this obscure book in the Bible, and it's right. I mean, I was nerdy, you know, like I loved history. I grew up in the 1980s and 90s in Virginia, so I was a Civil War person. I remember I had this in my locker in high school. Okay, so there you go. All these were honored in their generations and were the glory of their times. There be of them that have left a name behind them, their praises might be recorded, and some of them some there be which have no memorial, or perish as though they had never been born, or become as though they had never been born, and their children after them. But these were merciful men, whose righteousness hath not been forgotten, but their seed shall continually remain a good inheritance, and their children are within the covenant. Their seed standeth fast, and their children for their sakes. Their seed shall remain forever, and their glory shall not be blotted out. Their bodies are buried in peace. Their name liveth forevermore. Remember the USS Cole, the bombing, the sinking of that ship? That was, again, during the 90s. I remember President Bill Clinton at the time, when he was doing the memorial for that,
Bluetooth disconnected.
Those sailors that he quoted from this book of the Bible, you know, and I thought it was just brilliant. So again, like history, this is my theology of history. History is not a gotcha game. History is not a way of self-flagellation. History is not also a puff piece. History is not propaganda. History is a way towards the truth. And my mentor, when I taught in New Orleans, talked about that and talked about the gospel of history. And he was Catholic, but he was talking about the gospel of history in the sense of being like what history can do to help us learn, what history as a vessel can do to help us live our lives. And it's much more complex than simply we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, although that's in there. You know, it's something truly deeper than that. And I carry that on, you know, and I truly believe in it. The muse of history, the Greeks, was Cleo, and the Jewish people had an incredibly profound understanding of history, which us Christians inherited. And so, again, you're stuck with me as your rector, and I love talking about history. Interestingly, at seminary, church history is kind of on the bottom of the heap, you know? Theology's up here, systematic theology, liturgy, and then preaching, and then, you know, like on and down. And church history is much disappointed. It's kind of lower on the scale. I also thought about this project when I was working with, you know, I meet with other clergy groups and what they were doing for the 250th. And this is what Rabbi Michael Holtzman's doing at the Northern Virginia Hebrew congregation out there on Wheelie. And I learned very early on that I can't compete with Rabbi Michael, you know, but they're doing this thing called Faith 250, and they're reading different scriptures, secular scriptures together. And he does all this work. It's really, really interesting, fascinating. He does podcasts, and they have curriculum there and about rebuilding democracy, rebuilding trust, talking to your neighbor you don't agree with. And so I just share this just as a way of saying, for a hot second, I was like, oh, I'll do this too, and then as bandwidth issues came. But this is just incredible, and you can go on their website and learn all this. And obviously, as a Jewish community, they're at a different space, you know, in 26th than we are, and he's just a remarkable person, and a faith leader, and someone who I really look up to. And so I didn't sign us up for this, you know, but this is just a neat thing. They'll get together and read, like Emma Lazarus's poem that's on the Statue of Liberty, and they would get together and read that and say, what do we think about that? Or they'd get together and read our passage from today in Matthew's Gospel, the city on a hill. You know, that's a famous expression. It goes back to the Old Testament, but obviously the Puritans used that, John Winthrop, and then Ronald Reagan used that, and so you get together and you talk about that. And so instead you're getting the Semiquincentenial Lectures, but I hope it's more of a conversation that we'll be encountering. And this, I know you're interested, this is what St. Timothy's did 50 years ago, so 1976. It's amazing how these things happen. Jill Cox returned like a bunch of documents from St. Timothy's in our archives, and she just so happened to be the newsletters from 1976, and they did all these events. They're fascinating. A lot of stuff with organ, for whatever reason. It was organ in here still at that time, and so they had like, the organist at the time was just this dynamo. I was talking to Todd, having to do with handbells and everything, and it was just a really neat, they dressed up. They, you guys were alive for this, probably. I wasn't. I mean, not here, but you were alive somewhere. And it was just a different flavor. Tell me if I'm wrong, that in 1976, for the bicentennial, and from what I've read, it was very celebratory. And I just, you know, I don't think we're in a different spot as a country, as a church, you know, and that's really sad. You know, I think in some cases, look at this one. This is like the adult forum they had, very intense. Christian American interpenetration of religion and culture, the mission of America. That was hopefully mine will be a little more approachable, but more where that came from in terms of looking back on 50 years about St. Timothy's. They had a pancake supper that year, and they announced to the congregation that they raised $6 for everybody, and they're excited. So, and then there's also the connection to today. And so talking about Native Americans, indigenous peoples, it's interesting just to talk about nomenclature a little bit. A lot of the scholarly books, popular and otherwise, they use the term Indians again, and it comes from the thought process is call people the thing that they prefer to be called. And there's oftentimes that group of people, you know, Indians is the name that they go, you know, and so there we are. But this is interesting. The Episcopal Church all across our country, and there's the Navajo Land Diocese, and that's in, you can see where it is. It's in the parts of the Southwest, and it's a missionary diocese of the Episcopal Church. And 2 of my classmates are up for the bishop. You know, so 2 people I graduated with, or 1 person I graduated with, 1 person I graduated the next year. You know, so it's just, I mean, it's fascinating. The Episcopal Church is really great because its breadth and depth is amazing. We're talking about Haiti this week. Episcopal Church is there. Episcopal Church is everywhere, and including in the Native American experience. Unfortunately, a lot of that history is deeply tragic. Obviously, with the colonization, persecution, the Episcopal boarding school, that whole movement, and so. But here we are, and they were a joy to learn from. And then for this season of Lent, just giving you more examples of how this is just a living, breathing issue. It's not something that's dusty. The United Thank Offering, we probably did this at some point here at St. Timothy's, is the little boxes. Every year they do a fundraiser during Lent. I'm not participating in it.
Mite boxes.
Mite boxes, there we go. Mite, the widow's mites, and so you put like a little nickel or whatever in there, and so and they choose every year. People ask, you know, whoever the UTO picks is really good because they bring in some serious money, and so there's a whole curriculum in 2026 around this, and you can see the speakers and all that sort of thing. So, oh yeah, and there's one more thing: the Bexley Seabury Seminary, which is a seminary in the Midwest. They got this Lilly endowment to help establish an indigenous theological circle. So basically, a way of learning and gathering that is unique to indigenous people, Native Americans, and so all a living, breathing issue. Even as we're going to talk today about stuff that happened 400 or 500 years ago. Any questions? If people have questions, how are we doing on our live stream? You know, complaint department is always open, and it will be open after the service as well.
So I'm curious, where's the cathedral in Navajo land?
That's a good question. The question is, where's the cathedral in the Navajo land? And it's interesting, I don't know a lot about it, but there are missionary dioceses, which is like we have mission churches, and mission churches are churches that are supported by the diocese, and missionary diocese is a diocese that's supported by the Episcopal Church writ large. And so they have this process to elect a bishop, nominate candidates, listening sessions, all that sort of thing, petition period, and it was just really not unique, but they decided to pause. I feel like the Episcopal Church could never do that, but Anglo could never do that. They started to pause the process and let's just give us 6 more months of listening, and so they're still deciding it all and everything. So, okay, so I don't know.
It's not going to rock.
Yeah, I have no idea. Yeah. So this whole series, of course, I realized at some point that I made my job harder. I could have started in 1776, that's 250 years ago, and instead I decided to go backwards. And there's all sorts of arguments, I don't call them discussions, but really the arguments or fights about the start of American history. And 1776 has been an obvious one. The signing of the Declaration of Independence that we'll celebrate this year. But of course, you have to go back further than that. And one solution is you go back to the first settlement in 1607, which is we had the 400th anniversary here in 2007 for that. Another popular one is 1619, and you probably heard a lot about that, the 1619 Project, and that has to do with the first enslaved Africans were imported to the United States. 1619 Project, I'm forgetting the author right now, and so that caused a hullabaloo and a storm. So I'm just going to keep moving it back even further, and I'm going to move it further back to 1492 and the quote-unquote discovery of America. And so we're thinking all the way back to then, and just to make it even. There's Washington. Oh, there it is. 16. There's a movie or a documentary that was made about it. That sort of thing. So I'm gonna take it all the way back. Again, I'm just talking a little bit about nomenclature. We talked about discovery, which is an inaccurate term because no one was lost. You have to think about the people who were living here knew they were here, and there was European discovery. They didn't know what was here, and so you have that term. Sometimes it's referred to as an encounter, but that kind of makes it sound a little bit more pleasant than it actually was. And so I use the term collision, so you have this, this is the Columbian Exchange. You learn this in high school history. I taught it, all the goods that were passed back and forth. And again, the Columbian Exchange makes it sound like, it's like, oh, you get this, I get that, you get this, I get that, and there was a lot of that. And this just helps me thinking about this. It's something that I can't believe is true, that the horse was not indigenous to the Western Hemisphere. So we think, Native Americans, we think horses. I mean, maybe not the next thing.
It was indigenous to the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
And then the horses died out in the Western Hemisphere, they were still in Africa.
Hal is correct to me. The horse was indigenous to the Western Hemisphere. They died out, and then
But that's going back
Yeah.
a long time.
There you go. Thank you. And then the thing on there that you can't really see, but maybe you can, which is disease, and that's when we start to get into these moral questions about the Columbian Exchange. And that's when it really starts to kind of we think about it, and you think about moral responsibility and that sort of thing. So, just I like to think about it as a collision, just because it was such a different understandings of life. We believe, I have the Genesis passage printed out for you. We believe that all are created in God's image. We believe in we're all connected in that way. And then we think about this collision of folks who are just very different from each other. I'm going to skip over this one here and maybe come back to it and go to this one. And one of the fundamental differences is this understanding, and this is why I printed out the Genesis passage, the creation story that we have, the origin story that we have, the creation myth that we have, if you want to call that, what's written in Genesis 1 and 2, how that affects us, how that affected the explorers and settlers who came over 500 years ago, how that affects us to this day, what we think of when we think of the words Eden, what we think of when we think of the words paradise. And so that understanding colors all our perceptions and understandings of this time period. One of my favorite movies is Terrence Malick's The New World, which Terrence Malick is, incredible director, did A Tree of Life, did Days of Heaven, did all these things, and The New World is about John Smith and Pocahontas. It's not history, but it's beautiful just that it gets that collision of these two people coming together and not understanding each other, and there's this beautiful natural setting, and it's false. That's not how all this happened. But on some level, that Columbus and all the explorers believed when they arrived here, God, this is perfection. And they did so in the context of religious wars and religious rivalries, such that they believed that God was gifting this as a sign of his favor in the context of those religious wars. So the Catholics and Protestants were fighting. Spain's Catholic, England's Protestant, more or less. The Spanish roll over and they say, oh gosh, we got here first. This is this pristine land. We can get all this gold and silver from it, and that could help us beat the wicked Protestants back in Europe. This is, wow. And the English thought the same thing in reverse. And it seems perverse, and it is, but it's helpful to interrogate how we might think of the same things in our own day. And so that's what you're kind of working with. And with this, if you want to just grab it real quickly, the story, the Genesis story, and this is one of the reasons why I chose to do the Native Americans, because I just wanted to really focus on this concept of Genesis, the start of things, and the story is so familiar, I don't want to read it. There's two accounts in the book of Genesis, and it's helpful, I think, just to read it on your own time. To read these two stories, the line on the back page separates the two accounts, and I can bore you to death about why there's two Genesis stories, about how this affects, how it might have affected them to read this story, and then how it affects us as well as today. And I would say, you could say, gosh, well, we don't believe this to be literally true, and I think that's accurate. And then but then you think back to the scores, it doesn't really matter if they thought it was literally true. They thought it was the Word of God, this deep existential truth that I think we actually still do today. And so the Genesis story is first in the Bible. It's a good place to start in general. I keep moving around because it's the sun on this day. You'd think that I would love it. The sun is boring down, in my black shirt. It's like the greenhouse effect. Last week, Glenn Randolph came up to me right before the service, and it was the Feast of St. Timothy, and he said, Charles, I'm so excited to be reading, our epistle lesson, our New Testament lesson. I said, why? He goes, Charles, I'm a foreign language expert. I work for the State Department, and I get to read St. Timothy's origin story. And Glenn so happens to be fluent in Arabic, and so he was reading about all these places in Acts 18 or whatever, where Timothy was rolling around in what's now modern-day Turkey, and he got to read it, and he was like, "This is my life is fulfilled." Yeah, so I meant to mention that in the service somewhere. So here we go. And I just want to really think about it deeply. It's so of take it for granted, you know, what these words mean or what they say, that it's important. I like to read it on a sheet like this, which is not in the Bible, so that you can kind of read it without anything else, and it's really, you know, we could spend a year talking about all that sort of thing, but in the Genesis passage, we read that creation is good, and there's order to it, and that we as human beings have a particular place in that order. Even though we live in a post-Darwin, post-Copernicus world, we believe that today. Creation is a gift, and our job, our responsibility, our mandate, our command is to use that creation. And so when you get into this passage, this is still in the first Genesis account, then you start to get the idea of God's creation as being something that we're the master of. And that's something we think about the environment, we think about ecological consciousness, you know, that's an interesting thing, and how we interpret this passage is, of course, really important as we go. So you have this thing called the New World, and this thing that is, it seems like it's a new, it's unspoiled landscape, it's a cornucopia of goods, it's unpopulated. That was something that people perceived. They got here, European explorers, and they said, it's vacant. They knew there were people there, and they saw those people, but they also didn't see them. And it was partly because the framework that they saw them was, you know, we're all created in the image of God. We know that, but they're looking at them as, oh, they're not technologically advanced enough for me to consider them to be human. Another reason, this is what makes my job hard as a historian, is that there was no written history. And so for that brings an example of, oh gosh, well, these people aren't fully human. That's inaccurate too, obviously. But even the name that was given to here, Virginia, what does that mean? It means, it's named after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, but it's also this essential statement that there's no one there. And if there's no one there, then we can just roll it. The irony is this, and so this is where you really have to put your chronological hat on. And the first question I would always get as a history teacher was, do we have to learn dates? You know, this is a great figure, you know, that you have to learn dates. And I would always say, not only learn the numbers, you just have to know what happens before and after. You know, you have to go in order, and so that's basically there. So Columbus, you know, sailed the ocean blue, 1492. You know, we know that there was European contact before that, but that's a good marker, 1492. Jamestown, 1607. That's 115 years, 105, 115 years. In a way, at least from the English perspective, there was so much disease in that 100 that it was actually accurate that there was no one there. So, 1492, Columbus comes over, they do all this stuff, Spanish are coming here, Dutch are coming, everything, British have certain settlements, you know, are failing, and that takes time. The one thing that spreads rapidly is the disease. And so that's the thing that, in a way, I mean, I'm not trying to excuse the colonist behavior, but there was an incredible population, the opposite of a spike, downturn in that early time period. So by the time they got there, it was actually, they looked around and said, and when they thought all these people are, hey, how's it going? Come on in. No, come on in. That was below Archie. And so there was this thinking that there weren't anybody there, and the people that were, the Native Americans that were left over, were sickly and diseased. And so they thought, and one writer said it was like this, that imagine if you had, and it sounds like hyperbole, but imagine if you had from outer space, and then you rolled in and you had seen what Europe had looked like after World War II. You visit a concentration camp in a bombed-out city, and you say, well, this is normal. You know, this is what Europe is always like. That's what it would have been like to be in America in 1615. You would look and say, gosh, well, this doesn't look like there's much there. And there were also ecological things that were happening as well that kind of that changed that as well, which we might have time to get to. So, our next slide is again topical because I don't want to get too much in the weeds of exactly what's going on, but it's a little provocative. I think we can handle it. And so, I'm not cool enough to like Billie Eilish. You know, Billie Eilish is a singer. She is popular now, and among people who are much younger than me. And she won a Grammy, and when she got up and spoke for acceptance speech, she said, "No one is illegal on stolen land." And what she was referencing was the immigration crises that are going on around the country, and saying, well, if you really think about it, who was here first? We're all, that's what she was saying. And the Washington Post did an article on it. I don't know if you read it, the late great Washington Post. And it was kind of from a contract law perspective, which might have missed the point. But, and she was saying, we have to have contracts and we're going to blah, 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 blah. And so I bring this up because it connects us to the other part of the Genesis story, the second part. And the second part talks about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and Eve eating the apple, and this concept of original sin. And original sin is never mentioned in the Genesis passage. So it's never the writer of Genesis or God never say, and now I'm going to give you the doctrine of original sin. That is an interpretation that people have had for centuries. That this is that Eve eating the apple was the original mistake, the original strain that we did from the perfection of Eden, and because of that, we live in our world today. And that is a robust history in our own prayer book and everything. Some people say, well, that's us reading that into it. But regardless, we live in a world, it's kind of like the creation story. You or I might agree and say, yeah, the world wasn't created in 7 days. But we still believe it to be true. That we believe the essential contours of that story to be true. Likewise, Adam and Eve didn't eat that. That has never happened. We also believe the fundamental contours of that story to be true. And so what do we do with it? And so the deeper question we're asking today is, was the process of European colonization, that collision, the extermination, the genocide, whatever word it was, is that America's original sin? And how do we process that? Likewise, slavery, 1619, if you want to date it from there, is that our original sin? And what does that mean? Again, you could spend your entire life thinking about these issues, but I think that's what Billie Eilish, was hinting at maybe, and I think that's what we're all kind of going towards. So I'll just pause there and see if anyone has anything to say. Anything from the live stream, John?
Not yet.
Okay, yeah, they're just basking in my brilliance. There we go. Okay. Here is, take us back to, it's a really cool website that you can go onto, and you can see I typed in our own address here, and you can find out the tribes, languages, who is speaking what, where you are. And so it's interesting that there was, first of all, tremendous linguistic, ethnic diversity in the New World that European diversity pales in comparison. So you say, gosh, they speak a different language in every country in Europe. It's like, yeah, Portuguese is pretty similar to Spanish, is pretty similar to Italian, is pretty similar to that's Tim Allen would say this, you know, like, and that's what linguists would say. And then the New World is like, you guys know nothing about this. There's so much linguistic diversity, so much ethnic diversity that we don't even know about. As genuinely in Virginia was along the fault line, which is 95 in Virginia. And so everything east of that and then everything west of that. And there was actually Sioux, like a dialect of Sioux was spoken, which we generally associate with something way, you know, west and north of here was spoken. So I like just to think about that. And you think about that in terms of the thing that's really popular today among institutions who own land, the idea of a land acknowledgement. And the Episcopal Church website has tons of things like that. So that's where you say in your bulletin, in your website, in your, you know, wherever you say, we recognize, we acknowledge that we are living on land that was formerly occupied by formerly owned by the Manohoke or the Piscataway or something like that. And so that's another something in that question of original sin and how we deal with pain and loss and how we think about history. I don't, partly because I don't know how to do that, but there we are. So this interaction, this collision that was going on between the New World and the Old World, I use those terms just like I use Indian because it's easier. There's this myth that the New World was pristine. It's called the empty Amazon theory, so that when they encountered the Amazon, there was no one there. And that's because Columbus had killed everybody, like the disease had killed everybody. And that the myth is also that the Indians, Native Americans lived in a way
So what's the time of the price for Uber?
that was they were minimal.
Enjoying it.
You know, that Europeans used and abused their environment to their good, and that Native Americans couldn't or wouldn't, and that's a myth, you know, because I think it speaks to something about human nature that is it also has a way of saying that Native Americans making the other mistake that they weren't technologically advanced, that there wasn't enough of them. In fact, there were these huge cities with complex societies and all that. And so another book that came out in the last 20 years was really popular was Guns, Germs, and Steel. It was by Jared Diamond. He was I think a UCLA sociologist. And the thesis of Guns, Germs, and Steel was essentially that those three things allow the Europeans to mow down anybody they encounter, be it in Africa, be it in Asia, be it in the Americas. And I think it came out, it was hugely popular, you know, PBS documentaries and you name it, came under a lot of criticism. And one of them was just the idea in the New World, at least, that Native Americans actually had a complex society, that there were a lot of them, and that, for example, the military weaponry that they existed, that theirs was better than the European guns at that time. And the European guns were notoriously inaccurate, and that they actually told people, they trained the early settlers, don't fire them because then they'll know that we can't hit them. And so, like, just you can like fire them in the air or something, but don't because then they'll figure this out. John Smith, famously, he was injured in an explosion that happens. They hadn't really wrapped their brains around that. And I remember this, this famous question that Charles Mann, the author of that 1491 book, asked. He asked 7 anthropologists, where would you rather live in 1491? Would you rather live in the New World or the Old World? And like the anthropologists, of course, are, oh, we can't answer the question. And Frank was like, no, you need to answer this question. All 7 of them said, I'd rather live in the New World. Said, better diet, better medicine in many cases. The Native Americans who the Europeans encountered were taller, stronger, had better diet. I remember this. I remember this when I went to Jamestown as a kid. If you grew up in Virginia, you go to Jamestown Museum every year, sometimes 4 times a year. And they would ask you, would you rather live here? And they would show the Native American Society, or would live over there, and it was clear. But it's strange, and I think this is the criticism of the guns, germs, and steel thesis, is that technology somehow just flattens everything. There's no way to compete with that. And that's looking at it, I think, from a mistaken perspective, and it's a way of perceiving the Indians as suspended in time, untouched, as patsies, as someone who had no agency themselves. And that actually comes from the modern environmental movement, which has an interest in using land in a particular way, using our environment in a particular way, and if they can use Native American history in a way that can support their beliefs, then they'll do that. Even if it doesn't, not supported by history, that the Native Americans were okay with using the environment and diverting rivers and mining things when they could. It comes back to me, and I think I'll end here. We'll have times for questions as we go. That when I'll bring back to St. Timothy's, when the folks came here and they did this audit of our land here. You might remember me talking about this. This was a couple years ago now. We went through and they kind of showed me what was non-native and native, and they talked about how it used to be that the theory was just let nature run its course, and nature will find a way to put things back in balance, and that benign neglect is a good thing. And the lady told me, she was like, it used to be that, but now it's gotten so bad that we have to insert ourselves, that we have to take these measures because nature actually can't compete. And so that's all to say, when we think about Eden, when we think about our own creation myth, when we think about our today, what are our responsibilities to the earth? What are our responsibilities to Native Americans? And those are difficult questions, and I'm not, you can't tell, I'm not going to answer today. But I think the one thing I would say is that it's helpful to go back and read Genesis 1, read Genesis 2, read a little bit about the encounters, the recent scholarship about this collision that happened, and that might be helpful as we move forward in studying this period and period in our history. Okay, let me see if I'm done there. I am. Any questions? I know it's a lot.
So Charles, you have me totally baffled with the creation myth in Genesis, how we reconcile any of that to modern scientific knowledge and what we know now versus what was known then when it was maybe drafted in the first place. I accept the basic premise that God created everything. But beyond how he did it, or how she did it, or how it did it, is, I think, still subject to discovery in those cases. And I think about pick any topic you want, revolution, whatever.
House question for the folks following at home is about the Genesis account. It's a good one, and our ability to reconcile it with notions of modern science and theories of evolution. I don't think you can really. I wasn't trying to suggest that you could. I could tell you that scientists have gone back and said, you know what, actually, the order that the author of Genesis has it in is actually pretty close to, but I don't know if that does us any good. I would say it's a myth in that term. When you use the same myth, is something that's more powerful than literal truth. And it's a way of reading the Bible, which is very difficult. But I think well too. I mean, it used to, the one that people got really riled up, and this is happening in the early 20th century with the evolution debate and chimps and things like that, was the walls of Jericho falling down. You know, they really, like, how could that happen? You know, and you know, that's a different lecture. You know,
Well, Jericho's easy to understand, there are major faults.
how solve that one?
You know, play tectonics and take care of Jericho. But, yeah, it's the stuff that, you know, we've got to do, because when you get it, I think you just go down a rabbit hole when you go chase those things and miss the whole point.
Yeah, I agree. More questions? Thank you all.
Thank you.
Let's give our last sheet to
Is that why there's a break in the adult one?
you know, it's a lot TBD. You know, this person who makes this good, I think we're having another speaker then, so just get ready for a lot of speakers.
I'm ready to do it every Sunday.
Yeah.
I think that's a big topic.
I was like, article watching this just bees and how we saved the bees who didn't save we saved two bees and then killed all the other bees. And you're just like, oh gosh. Yes.
Up there, but I,
Yeah.
so